The city never slept, but it wasn't alive either. It was a beast, and it breathed through steel lungs and concrete veins, pulsing with the rhythm of underground trains and sirens that howled like wolves in the distance. Above ground, the glass towers sparkled like polished lies, clean and towering, while beneath them, deep beneath, the truth rotted in tunnels, thick with mildew, rust, and the sweat of generations who had bled to keep this machine running. Rain fell in oily streaks, hitting the sidewalk like spit from a sky that held no mercy. And under flickering streetlights, a rat scurried past the feet of an old woman who walked like time owed her an apology. Her name was Clara Baker, though most had forgotten it. But the bones of the city remembered, because her family built half of it. She walked slowly, elegantly, cane tapping in rhythm with distant train tracks, wrapped in a long burgundy coat that cut through the grey like a fresh wound. The few who passed her offered glances, some curious, others tired, none knowing they were in the presence of someone whose blood helped pour the very cement they walked on. She descended the station steps with a quiet authority, like royalty in exile, the scent of hot metal and stale urine rising to greet her like an insult too familiar to sting. A transit worker saw her, nodded respectfully, he knew, but behind her, watching from the far end of the platform, stood Officer Jared Coulson, thumbs hooked in his belt, chewing the inside of his cheek, eyes fixed on her like she was a problem looking for a solution. He didn't know her name, didn't care. To him, she was a shadow where there should have been silence. An old black woman moving too freely, standing too tall. He adjusted his vest, his gaze narrowing, and in his mind, the badge on his chest didn't protect the people. It protected the order, and people like her, they were the noise in the system. The train screamed in the distance, its lights carving through the tunnel like a judgment, and somewhere, beneath the city's hum, a fuse lit, the kind that didn't hiss or spark, the kind that waited. The metal doors of the subway creaked open, like the mouth of something ancient and tired, exhaling a gust of heat and grime onto the platform where Clara Baker stood, unmoved, upright, eyes sharp beneath the brim of her deep red hat. She stepped inside with grace, her cane tapping once against the floor before she moved toward the nearest seat, not because she needed rest, but because she knew what was hers to claim. The car was nearly empty, 2 teenagers huddled over a phone, a man in a stained jacket sleeping with his mouth open, and one uniformed shadow that stepped in behind her, boots clicking slow and heavy. Officer Coulson didn't sit. He stood like a statue near the door, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Clara like a hawk watching a mouse that refused to run. For a long moment, nothing happened but the clatter of the train picking up speed, the tunnel walls flashing like dying film reels. Then, without warning, he approached. "Identification," he said flatly, not as a question, but as a command, sharp, public, dehumanizing. Clara looked up at him, her gaze steady, unblinking. "Pardon," she said, voice calm, polite, but heavy with the weight of a century. "You heard me. ID. Name. Reason for being here," he snapped, louder this time. The teens stopped whispering. The sleeping man stirred. Clara didn't move. "Is there a reason, officer? I've done nothing wrong." And that was the spark, her voice, too clear, too unafraid. "You're loitering. Sitting without a ticket is grounds for detention," he lied, stepping closer. He knew it wasn't true. She knew it too. But the badge gave him power, and power doesn't need truth, only presence. "I own this line," she said quietly, not as a threat, but a reminder. He snorted. "You own a seat, maybe, not this train, not in my city." Then he reached down and yanked her cane from her hand. The train swayed. Clara gripped the metal bar. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from rage held too long. "You're out of line," she said, and those nearby froze, sensing the shift in the air. "No, ma'am, you are," he hissed, then shoved her shoulder. She staggered, one hand slipped. Her hip hit the floor with a sound too sharp for the young to ignore. "Get back in your place," he muttered, stepping over her, the cane still in his grip like a stolen scepter. The train screeched to a halt. The doors opened. He walked out without looking back, and the silence left behind was deafening. Clara lay there for a moment, the cold floor pressing against her cheek, a century of dignity scattered in the dirt of the system her family built. No one helped her up. Not yet. Because when something sacred is violated, even witnesses forget how to move. And far above, in the city her blood helped raise, her name was already being turned into hashtags no one could pronounce right. The next morning, the city woke up hungry, screens lighting up with headlines, voices on morning radio barking half-truths, grainy footage already looping through millions of feeds, a subway car, a fallen woman, a uniformed man stepping over her like discarded luggage. No sound in the video, only images, the push, the fall, the silence. But the silence spoke louder than any scream. In a precinct barely 5 blocks from the incident, Officer Jared Coulson sat at his desk with his feet up, sipping bad coffee and scrolling through his phone, lips curled into a grin. She tripped, he'd already told his captain. She got mouthy, acted confused, no ID, no ticket. I followed procedure. He knew the script, and he knew it well. So did the others, and none of them were going to challenge it. Not for a woman like her. "Ain't she someone important?" a younger officer had asked, glancing at the footage. Coulson shrugged. "They're always someone important when they're lying on the ground." Laughter, short and easy. The kind shared between men who knew the rules were theirs to bend. Meanwhile, in a private room at St. Anne's Hospital, Clara Baker stared at the ceiling. One wrist bandaged, ribs aching with every breath. Her coat torn. Her pride untouched. Beside her, a nurse, a black woman, young, tense, spoke in a whisper. "Mrs. Baker, they're already spinning it, saying you resisted, that you shouted, that the officer was startled." Clara's eyes didn't move. "Did they name me?" "Not yet, just elderly woman." That stung more than the bruise on her jaw. Not because her name brought her power, but because erasing it was the first act of domination. She had been reduced to a category, an incident, a footnote. Elsewhere, across boardrooms and newsrooms, the conversation was the same. Keep it quiet, keep it neutral, don't stir the pot. In one office, high above the city, a man in a tailored suit, her nephew, Marcus Baker III, stared out at the skyline and clenched his fists. "They don't know who she is," he said. His advisor, a white woman in pearls, hesitated. "They don't care who she is," she replied. "This isn't about respect. It's about control." And far below, back in the subway tunnels, someone had already scrubbed the blood off the platform, a fresh coat of yellow paint over the spot where her body had landed. Just another surface polished, just another truth buried beneath boots and concrete. And Jared Coulson? He walked the same beat that day, chest puffed slightly higher, eyes scanning for the next face that didn't quite belong. Because in his world, power wasn't earned, it was enforced. And those who dared to stand tall were meant to be put down. Let's take a short pause. If you're still with us, write in the comments where you're listening from. Has anything like this ever happened in your life or community? We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to follow so you don't miss the next chapter. Now, we continue. The camera didn't blink. It watched everything, silent, cold, permanent. Perched in the upper corner of the subway car, it captured the exact moment Clara Baker's body hit the floor, her red hat rolling like a fallen crown across the tiles. There was no sound in the clip, but those who watched it swore they could hear the weight of the impact. Her cane lay inches from her fingers. Officer Coulson didn't glance back. He stepped off the train as though brushing dust from his uniform, while the city's heart skipped a beat and kept moving. By 3:05 p.m., the footage had been copied, passed between palms like contraband. By 3:12 p.m. it had a title, Subway Justice. The question mark was important. It gave room for denial. And denial was everywhere. News anchors blurred her face. Police statements danced around her age, her race, her name. The officer responded to what appeared to be a security concern, the press release read. The individual was uncooperative. Online, the comments lit up like wildfire. Another one trying to play the victim. Bet she had a record. Why don't they ever show what really happened? And beneath them, buried deep, were the quiet voices. Her family owns half the transit system. Do they know who she is? But those voices were drowned in waves of coded language and weaponized ignorance. At the precinct, Coulson sat in the briefing room, watching the video play on loop. He smirked every time the woman hit the ground. "Look at that," he said to a colleague. "Takes a little bump and suddenly she's Rosa Parks." Laughter filled the room, not loud, but knowing. It was a language spoken without words, a system that didn't need to say it out loud. They don't belong here unless we say so. Across the city, Clara's name still hadn't been spoken. Reporters circled her identity like vultures without landing. No one dared mention the Baker family, not yet. Too big, too connected. But silence wasn't protection. It was pressure, and it was building. In her hospital bed, Clara watched the footage herself, her fingers folded neatly in her lap. She watched the moment he pushed her, watched the way no one moved to help. Not the teens, not the man sleeping, not even the conductor. She watched it again, and again. Not out of pain, but precision. Because when the city you helped build turns its back on you, you don't fall. You calculate, you remember, and you wait. And somewhere, deep in the tunnels beneath the streets, someone else was watching too. Not for justice, not for peace, but for the perfect time to strike back. The city buzzed with an unsettling energy. It wasn't the usual hum of urban life, not the usual pace of traffic, or the normal rush of people chasing after time they didn't own. This was different. There was a crackling tension in the air, a disturbance beneath the surface, felt but never seen. Everyone was talking about it. The subway incident, the woman on the floor, Officer Coulson's push, but no one was talking to each other. The conversation wasn't real. It was fragmented. It was noise. It was nothing. At the local news station, the story was being dissected over and over. The headline, "Subway Incident Sparks Debate Over Police Action." On one side of the screen, a panel of white commentators discussed the importance of respecting authority, how the elderly woman's attitude could have been misinterpreted. On the other side, a lone black journalist, a man who had witnessed the aftermath, pressed his hands to his face, shaking his head. "Are we really still doing this?" he asked, his voice quiet, but laced with the raw bitterness of experience. The others, unable to grasp the weight in his words, nodded blandly, eyes glancing at their notes. The system worked for them, but it had never worked for people like him, or for people like Clara Baker. "You see, she's an old woman. She's probably seen things," one of the panelists offered, his voice patronizing. "Maybe she was confused. Maybe she got upset. But the officer is just doing his job." Another commentator nodded. "Exactly. We don't know what happened before the cameras started rolling. Who's to say she didn't provoke him?" The journalist leaned forward. "You didn't see what happened before. You only saw what he did to her, what he made us watch. You didn't see what he did." But the media circus had already spun out of control. It wasn't about the truth. It wasn't even about Clara. It was about control, and about the narrative that was far more important than reality. Meanwhile, as the city clung to its collective ignorance, Clara sat in her hospital room, watching the storm unravel on the small television in front of her. Every so often, her fingers would twitch, as if to reach out, to turn the volume down, to shut it all out. But she didn't. She needed to hear it. She needed to know what they were saying. She needed to feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, because it wasn't just about her. It was about everything her family had built, and everything they had fought for. Marcus Baker III sat in his office on the 30th floor of the Baker Family Transit Authority building, overlooking the skyline he knew so well. But today, the view felt different. It felt like a cage, like the bars of something so powerful and so entrenched that it couldn't be escaped. "Call the lawyers," he said, his voice tight, barely audible above the hum of the office. "We need to shut this down. We need to contain this." His assistant, a young woman with wide eyes and a nervous twitch, looked at him hesitantly. "Do you really think—" "I don't care what you think. Just do it," Marcus snapped, his patience wearing thin. The assistant nodded quickly and disappeared out the door, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He stared out at the city, his family's city. For years, they had controlled the arteries of it. the pulse of its transportation system. They owned the underground world. It was theirs, and they had made it theirs through grit, determination, and a few well-placed deals. They had fought for every inch of it. They had fought through the hostility of the city council, through the corrupt politicians who had tried to push them out, through the systemic racism that had always been present in this city, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rear its ugly head. Now, it was here, and it was ugly. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang once, twice, then a voice on the other end picked up. "Marcus, I saw the footage. Are you sure we want to do this?" "I'm sure," he said firmly. "We can't let this spiral out of control. This woman, she's a problem. She's going to make this bigger than it is. We need to shut it down before it gets worse." "What about your aunt? She's not going to want this. She doesn't have a choice. She'll understand," Marcus said coldly, his fingers tapping impatiently against the desk. His mind was already racing, mapping out how he could fix this, how he could protect the family's legacy. He had always been the one to smooth things over, to make the tough calls. He had done it with ease before, but now, with the media circling like vultures, it felt different. It felt personal. He had no idea how deeply the city's resentment ran, how much the people had already begun to turn on them, how the people who had once ridden their trains now saw Clara Baker as a symbol of something else, something they didn't want to understand. Back at the hospital, Clara's eyes never left the screen. She had seen it all, every commentator, every twisted word, every attempt to discredit her. But there was something different about this time. The pressure was mounting. She could feel it. She could feel the cracks in the system starting to form. They thought they could bury her, erase her, take her dignity, and leave her in the dust. But she wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't just about the push. It wasn't just about the fall. It was about what she represented, what her family represented. And that was something they couldn't take away, no matter how hard they tried. The next day, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. More footage was leaked. Clips of Officer Coulson laughing with his colleagues at the precinct, mocking Clara's fall, making jokes about how she was too old to be that loud and how she didn't know her place. It spread like wildfire, and the anger, the resentment, the rage, slowly but surely started to shift. Protests began to form outside the Baker family headquarters, outside the subway stations, in every corner of the city. People who had once been passive, who had once simply ridden the trains and ignored the system, now had a cause. Now, they had a name. Clara Baker. But Clara knew something the protesters didn't. She knew how deep the corruption ran. She knew that the system didn't just protect the officers. It protected the ones who controlled it all. And her family? They controlled the city's pulse. But power, she had learned, was fragile. And all it took was one small crack to send everything into chaos. Marcus watched the protest from his office, his stomach twisted in knots. He had never seen this before. Never seen the city turn so quickly, so violently. The headlines kept coming, each more damning than the last. The Baker family was under fire, and there was no escaping it. In the quiet of the night, Clara's thoughts were dark, calculating. She had seen this kind of thing before. She knew how the media worked. She knew how to play the game, and she had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to fight back was not to fight at all. It was to let the enemy destroy themselves. She wasn't done, not by a long shot, and neither was the city. The protests grew louder. They erupted with the force of a thunderclap, shaking the foundations of the city. It didn't take long before the signs appeared. Baker family. Corruption runs deep. Stop police brutality. The chants, the anger, the pain of decades of oppression. Every cry was now directed at one family, one woman, and the system they had come to represent. The Baker family, once a pillar of the city's success, now found themselves at the center of a storm they never saw coming. Marcus Baker III had seen protests before. He had seen his family's name dragged through the mud, through the press, through the courts. But never like this. Never with this kind of fire, And as he watched the crowds from his penthouse office, watching the flickering images of angry faces, he could feel the pressure mounting in the air, a storm just waiting to break. For the first time in years, Marcus felt small. It wasn't the type of small you could ignore, though. It was the type of small that gnawed at your soul, the type of small that made you wonder just how far your reach really extended. He had always been untouchable, wrapped in the power and privilege of the family legacy. He had been groomed for this, for leadership, for control. But control slipped through his fingers like sand in a storm. The more he tried to tighten his grip, the faster it slipped away. "Get me the lawyers," he said, his voice cold, detached. He had to regain control, and quickly. They couldn't afford another misstep. Every minute that passed brought more exposure, more questions. And Marcus wasn't sure how long the Baker name could survive this kind of scrutiny. His assistant entered quickly, her face pale. "Marcus, it's bad. There's a petition, a public one. People are calling for your family to sell the transit system. They want you to step down from managing it. They're demanding accountability." Marcus froze. The idea of selling the family's legacy, the transit empire built by generations before him, felt like a dagger to his chest. He had never considered the possibility, but now it was being thrust in his face. Step down. It sounded like a demand, not just a suggestion. "I don't care about a petition. Do we have any leverage left?" he asked, his voice tight. "Not much. The media's pushing hard on your Aunt Clara. They're calling her a symbol now. It's not just the incident anymore. It's everything. The family, the power, the history. It's all coming down." Marcus slammed his fist on the desk, a jarring sound that echoed through the room. "We're not going to let it come down. Not like this." In the depths of the city, Clara Baker lay in her hospital bed, watching the news unfold. She was too proud to show any outward sign of weakness, but inside, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, suffocating her. The name Baker had always been associated with success, with strength, with the kind of power that people feared and revered in equal measure. But now, it was a symbol of something far darker. It was a symbol of the system that had broken so many before her, of all the black men and women who had been pushed down by a world that wasn't made for them. The irony was not lost on her. Her family had fought for decades to build this empire, to own a piece of the city's soul. And now she was being dragged through the mud as the face of that empire's most corrupt tendencies. She hadn't built it all just to see it fall apart at the hands of a crooked cop, of an ignorant public, of a system so entrenched in its own racism that it couldn't see past the color of her skin. But Clara Baker was no stranger to struggle. She had been born into it. Her grandfather had built the first lines of the transit system with little more than sweat and determination, fighting every step of the way against those who said black people couldn't own anything of significance. He had fought to provide for his family, to create something that would last. And now, his legacy was in jeopardy because of a single, senseless act of violence. The video of her fall had gone viral. But it wasn't just her fall that had people talking. It was the officer's actions. The way he shoved her, the way he dismissed her like she was nothing, like she didn't matter, like the life of an elderly black woman was worth nothing. The more Clara watched, the more she realized this wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about one woman's fight for dignity. This was about everything her family had fought for. This was about the system that had crushed so many black lives, so many black dreams, so many black legacies, and Clara Baker wasn't about to let it be destroyed without a fight. "Get me the media," she said to the nurse who had been sitting quietly by her side, watching her every move. "Ma'am?" the nurse asked, confused. "The media," Clara repeated, her voice strong despite the ache in her chest. "Call the station. I need to speak to someone." The nurse hesitated, but Clara's gaze was unwavering. After a long moment, the nurse nodded and left the room. Within the hour, the television in Clara's room flickered to life, and a reporter appeared on the screen. The woman's face was tight with concern, but Clara could see the hunger in her eyes. She was ready for a story, for a headline, for anything that would feed the firestorm outside. "I'm here with Clara Baker, a woman who was violently shoved by Officer Jared Coulson of the city police force just days ago." "Mrs. Baker!" Thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. Clara's eyes narrowed as she watched the reporter, her thoughts running like a river, crashing against the rocks of her anger. She wasn't just going to let them spin this. She wasn't going to let them turn her into a victim. She was a fighter, and the world would see that. I'm not here to talk about the incident, Clara began, her voice calm, controlled, but filled with an unshakable fire. I'm here to talk about something far more important. The reporter blinked, surprised by the shift in tone. And what might that be? Clara leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto the camera. I'm here to talk about the system that allowed this to happen. A system that has been built on the backs of people like me. People who have fought, who have died, and who have built the very foundation of this city. The same system that allows officers like Coulson to push an elderly woman to the ground without consequence. The same system that tells my family, my people, that we don't belong, that we're not good enough, that our lives don't matter. The reporter's mouth opened, but no words came out. She wasn't sure how to respond to the raw truth in Clara's voice. Clara's words, like arrows, pierced the silence. This isn't just about a single incident, Clara continued. This is about the history that has been buried under concrete and asphalt. This is about the people who built this city with their blood, sweat, and tears, only to be forgotten by the very people who benefit from it. And I will not let that continue. I will not let my family's legacy be torn down because a system that is broken cannot stand the weight of its own lies. The reporter's gaze shifted, unsure of how to handle the gravity of what Clara was saying. But Clara didn't need the reporter's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. The truth was hers, and the city would have to listen. Across town, Marcus watched the interview unfold on his own screen. The impact of Clara's words hit him like a sledgehammer. She was no longer the helpless woman they had once thought she was. She was a symbol of everything they had tried to bury, everything they had tried to ignore, and now it was all coming back. In the streets below, the protest grew even louder. The city, once so silent, now had a voice. The people were demanding change. They were demanding justice, and no amount of money, no amount of power would be able to silence them. The battle was just beginning. The chaos had settled into a rhythm now, a disturbing, predictable pulse that the city couldn't escape. The protests hadn't subsided. If anything, they had grown, swelling like an unstoppable tide, crashing against the indifferent walls of the city's elite. Clara's name had become a rallying cry, not just for those who marched in the streets, but for those who felt the sting of injustice every day of their lives. Every sign, every chant, every face in the crowd was a reminder that the silence of the past was no longer an option. The Baker family, once revered and untouchable, now stood on the precipice of an all-consuming scandal. And Marcus Baker III, the man who had spent years consolidating the family's power, was fighting a losing battle. The media, once an ally in protecting the family name, now devoured it whole. Articles, opinions, editorials. Every inch of space was filled with condemnation. The once pristine image of a wealthy black family that had risen above their origins had been replaced by the grim reality of their complicity in a system that had abused its power for far too long. Marcus sat in his office, staring at the piles of paperwork and legal briefs that had become his constant companion. The phone calls from the lawyers had been endless. Public relations teams had tried to spin the narrative, but no amount of press releases or polished statements could undo the damage. The truth, Clara's truth, had seeped through every crack in the family's carefully constructed facade. The lawyers had advised him to stay silent, to let the system run its course. But Marcus had always been the one to take control, to make the decisions. And now, he was losing control of everything he had ever known. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He looked up, his gaze cold. It was his assistant, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Marcus, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice shaky. "She says it's urgent." "Who?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed. She didn't give her name," the assistant replied, stepping back nervously. But she's from the press. Marcus's stomach churned. Another reporter. The last thing he needed was more cameras, more questions. He rubbed his temples, trying to push back the headache that was building in his skull. Send her in, he muttered, barely able to mask the frustration in his voice. The door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was tall, confident, with sharp features that suggested both intelligence and resolve. Her eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto Marcus as soon as she entered. There was something about her, something different. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't here to ask him soft questions or play the game. She was here to confront him. Marcus Baker, she said, her voice steady and deliberate. I'm not here to waste your time with pleasantries. I'm here to talk about the truth. Marcus stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't know what to make of this woman. She wasn't like the others. There was no fear in her. No hesitation. The truth? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think you know what the truth is? She didn't flinch. I know enough to know that your family's empire is built on a foundation of lies. You've been running this city for too long, Marcus. And now, the truth is catching up with you. Marcus felt a rush of anger. You think you know my family? You think you know what we've been through? You think you can just walk in here and… I know everything, she interrupted. I know about the corruption, the backroom deals, the way you've turned your family's transit empire into a weapon used against the people who built it. And I know about Clara. Her words cut through him like a knife. He had tried to keep Clara's name from being dragged into the mud. He had tried to silence her, to control the narrative. But this woman was tearing down the walls he had built. You don't know anything about Clara, Marcus spat, his voice rising. She's my aunt. She's part of this family. She built this empire. Oh, I know exactly who Clara is, the woman replied, her voice cold. She's the last of a bloodline that fought for everything you've taken for granted. She's the one person who still has the courage to stand up and fight for what's right. And you're just the spoiled heir who's willing to sacrifice everything, everyone, to keep your power intact. Marcus felt his blood boil. The audacity of this woman, coming into his office, accusing him of betrayal. I don't need you to lecture me about power, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't get to where I am by being weak. I built this family's legacy. And I'll be damned if I let some reporter, some outsider, tear it all down because of a lie. The woman didn't move, didn't flinch. It's not a lie, Marcus. The lie is the story you've been telling yourself, telling everyone, for years. The lie is that your family is untouchable, that the system you've built is above reproach. But it's not. It's rotting from the inside, and it's going to fall, whether you like it or not. Marcus clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. He could feel the anger rising within him, threatening to overtake him, but he held it in. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. You think you can just come in here and destroy everything I've worked for? He asked, his voice tight with fury. You think you can just take everything away from me? The woman's gaze softened, just slightly, but the determination in her eyes didn't waver. No, I'm not here to destroy you, Marcus. I'm here to remind you of what you've forgotten. And what's that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The truth, she said simply. You've forgotten what the truth is. The truth is that people like you and your family don't get to hide behind your wealth and power anymore. The truth is that the people you've oppressed, the people you've ignored, the people you've stolen from, they are taking back what's rightfully theirs, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Marcus stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had always believed that power was the answer, that money and influence were the keys to everything. But now, as he looked at this woman, this stranger who had come into his world and exposed him for what he was, he realized how fragile it all was. He had been living in a bubble, insulated from the realities of the world outside. But now, that bubble was bursting, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You can't win this fight, Marcus said, his voice a mere whisper now. You think the people will stand with you. They don't know what they're fighting for. They don't understand what's at stake. The woman's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Oh, they understand. They understand perfectly, and they're going to keep fighting, whether you like it or not. As she turned to leave, Marcus felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. She had come to remind him of something he had tried to ignore for far too long. The system that had allowed him to rise to power was broken, and sooner or later, it would crumble under its own weight. The question wasn't if the Baker family would survive this. The question was how long they could hold on before the truth tore them apart. And in that moment, Marcus knew. He wasn't prepared for what was coming next. The morning sky was grey, heavy with the weight of the coming storm. The city felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. People moved through the streets like ghosts, their eyes glazed over, faces hardened by the tension that hung in the air. Clara Baker had been in the hospital for days, but her presence was everywhere, on every street corner, in every news outlet, in every conversation. She was a symbol now, whether she wanted to be or not. A symbol of resistance, of defiance, of a long history of suffering finally reaching a boiling point. But to the powers that be, she was just a problem that needed to be dealt with. The media circus had become an uncontrollable wildfire, and the politicians, the police, the elite, everyone who stood to lose from the truth being exposed, were scrambling to put out the flames. They had tried to smear her, tried to turn her into a villain. They had tried to erase her name, but it was too late. Clara's voice had already reverberated through the streets, and now the whole city was listening. In the high-rise offices of the Baker family headquarters, Marcus Baker III sat hunched over a desk, his fingers gripping the edge of the polished wood, his mind spinning. He could feel the walls closing in. The protests were getting bigger, the crowds more insistent. His family's name was being dragged through the mud, and it wasn't just his reputation on the line now. It was the legacy of generations before him, the transit system, the empire they had built with blood, sweat, and tears. All of it was at risk. He had tried to do everything by the book. He had hired the best lawyers, the most experienced PR teams. He had gone to the press, made his statements, and offered his apologies. But nothing was working. The truth had a way of breaking through the lies, no matter how much money or influence you had. And Clara was the one thing he couldn't control. She was the last piece of the puzzle that had never quite fit, the one loose thread that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. And now she was fighting back, refusing to stay silent, refusing to be intimidated by the system that had spent years oppressing her and her family. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was his assistant again. "Marcus, there's someone here to see you. It's urgent." He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. "Who is it now?" "She says she's with the protests. She wants to speak to you. It's about your aunt." Marcus's blood ran cold. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to face it. Clara's supporters had become more vocal in the past few days, and now they were coming for him. "Send her in," Marcus said, his voice flat, resigned. The door opened, and a woman stepped into the room. She was tall, confident, with an air of authority that made Marcus sit up straighter. Her clothes were simple, black jeans, a leather jacket, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. She walked toward the desk, her gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "Marcus Baker," she said, her voice calm but heavy with purpose. "I'm here to talk to you about your aunt." "I know who you are," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "You're one of Clara's supporters. I've seen you on TV." The woman nodded. "I'm not just a supporter. I'm someone who's seen this system for what it is, and I'm not backing down." "I don't have time for any more of this," Marcus said, his voice tight. "We've apologized. We've addressed the situation. The protests are only getting bigger, but we're doing everything we can to contain this." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Everything you can? You've had your people in the media, in the courts, everywhere. You've been trying to bury the truth, But that's not going to work anymore, Marcus. Marcus stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. He walked to the window, his back to the woman. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "You don't understand what this family has built, what we've fought for. We've given everything to this city. Everything. And now you want to tear it all down because of a single incident. A single mistake." The woman followed him to the window, her footsteps silent. "A single mistake? Is that what you're calling it now? A mistake? What happened to your aunt wasn't a mistake, Marcus. It was a calculated act of violence. It was the product of a system that treats people like her like like nothing." Marcus turned around sharply, his face flushed with anger. "And what would you have me do? What do you want from me?" "What I want," the woman said, her voice cold and unyielding, "is for you to stop pretending like this isn't bigger than just your aunt. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than the Baker family. This is about every person who's ever been treated like they don't matter. This is about the system that's been in place for centuries, keeping people like Clara, people like me, people like all of us, down." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just change that? You think you can just—" The woman held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, but we're not going to stop fighting until we've seen the change we deserve." The tension in the room hung heavy, like the calm before a storm. Outside, the city was alive with noise, the distant sound of chanting and shouting making its way into the building, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus knew that the protests weren't going to stop. They would only grow. The anger, the frustration, the resentment, it was all too deep, too real for him to ignore anymore. "We're not going anywhere," the woman said, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce intensity. "And neither is your aunt. So the question is, what are you going to do?" Marcus stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so much time fighting to maintain control, to protect the family's legacy, that he hadn't realized how far gone the city was. He hadn't realized how far gone he was. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine. I can't keep fighting a losing battle." The woman nodded, as if she had been expecting those words. "Then it's time to make a choice, Marcus. A real one. Not for you, not for your family, but for the people who've been silenced, for the people who've been forgotten." Marcus stood there, frozen, as the weight of everything crashed down on him. The choices he had made, the lies he had told, the systems he had helped build, they were all coming back to him now, and there was no escaping them. He had tried to control the story. He had tried to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. But now, the truth was unavoidable. It was right in front of him, and he couldn't outrun it anymore. Outside the window, the protests continued to grow. The streets were flooded with people, their signs held high, their voices loud and defiant. The sound of their chanting filled the air, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of hopelessness creeping over him. But Clara wasn't done. The storm was far from over. The sun barely peeked through the clouds as the protests raged outside, their fury a reflection of the storm that had been brewing beneath the surface for far too long. The streets of the city were alive with movement, a sea of bodies chanting, their voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a relentless shore. Signs waved overhead, their words powerful, demanding, accusing. Justice for Clara Baker. No more silence. End police brutality. Every step forward was a step in defiance, a declaration that the time for change had come, and it was unstoppable. Inside the Baker family's headquarters, the mood was different. Cold, quiet, tense. Marcus Baker III sat in his office, his back hunched over the desk, eyes bloodshot from the sleepless nights spent trying to hold everything together. His family's empire was unraveling, piece by piece, and he had no idea how to stop it. The weight of the protests outside, the mounting pressure from the media, and the growing public outcry, he couldn't ignore it anymore. The world was watching, and the system he had worked so hard to maintain was coming apart at the seams. He had never been good at asking for help, never been one to admit weakness. But now, as the phone buzzed again with another incoming call, he was about to lose his grip on everything. He took a deep breath, reaching for the receiver. "Marcus?" The voice on the other end of the line was calm, controlled, but there was a noticeable edge to it. "We need to talk." It was his lawyer, and by the sound of his voice, Marcus knew the conversation wasn't going to be a pleasant one. "I don't have time for more bad news," Marcus said, running a hand through his hair, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "We've already made our statement. I've apologized. I've done everything I can." "That's the problem," the lawyer replied. "Your apology doesn't matter anymore. The people aren't buying it. The media isn't buying it. And frankly, they're about to demand more than just words. They're looking for action. Real action." Marcus closed his eyes, his jaw clenched tightly. "What are you suggesting?" "The board of directors is meeting this afternoon," the lawyer said, his voice low. "There's talk of cutting ties with the transit system. They're concerned about the damage to the family's reputation. They're asking for you to step down, Marcus." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Step down. It was unthinkable. This was his empire, his legacy. It had been built with the sweat and blood of his ancestors. He wasn't just going to hand it over to the masses, to the people who wanted to tear it all down. But the longer he thought about it, the more the idea settled in his mind. The protests, the pressure, the media, they weren't going to stop until the Baker name had been destroyed. And if he didn't step aside, if he didn't make the hard choice, he knew it would all fall apart. "No," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I won't do it. Marcus, I'll fight. I'll make them listen," he snapped, slamming his fist onto the desk. "I'm not letting my family's legacy be destroyed because of some mistake. I won't be bullied into submission." The lawyer sighed. "You're not listening. The board is already talking about selling the transit system, about cutting their losses. It's already happening. You don't have much time." Marcus slammed the phone down, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He couldn't lose everything. He couldn't let them win. But the question lingered in his mind. What was he really fighting for? Was it the family legacy? Was it power? Or was it just his own pride, refusing to admit that he had lost control? In the streets outside, the protests had only grown louder. Thousands of people had gathered, their anger palpable, their demands growing more intense with every passing hour. Clara Baker was no longer just an individual. She had become a symbol, a beacon of resistance against the system that had kept her family in power for so long. The protests weren't just about Clara anymore. They were about every black person who had been oppressed, every voice that had been silenced, every life that had been torn apart by the corruption that ran through the veins of the city. Clara's voice echoed through the streets, her words piercing the night like a knife. She had become the face of a movement that demanded justice, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence for too long. "I will not be silenced," Clara's voice rang out over the loudspeakers, her speech broadcasted to the crowds below. "I will not be erased by the system that has oppressed us for generations. I will not stand by while they try to bury the truth. This is our fight. This is our time." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in a wave of unbridled fury. Clara had become more than just a victim. She had become their leader, their rallying cry, and they were ready to fight with her, to stand with her, to tear down the walls that had kept them in the shadows for so long. Back at the Baker family headquarters, Marcus paced back and forth, the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him with each step. His mind raced, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and anger. He had always been able to control the narrative, to shape the story to fit his desires. But now, the story was slipping out of his grasp, and he had no idea how to stop it. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a text message from his sister. "Marcus, we need to talk. This is bigger than just you or me. We need to do something." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, storming out of the office, determined to find his sister and make a decision. He couldn't do this alone. It was time to confront the truth. Clara's fight had become more than just a struggle for justice. It had become a battle for control of the narrative. The media had turned her into a martyr, And now it was time for her to take back the power. She wasn't going to let the Baker family, or anyone, define her. She wasn't going to be just another victim in the story they had written for her. She was going to rewrite it herself. But the road ahead was dangerous. The system was built to keep people like Clara down. The police, the politicians, the wealthy elite, they would do whatever it took to maintain their grip on power. And Clara knew that the fight was far from over. As the protests raged on outside, Clara stood in front of the crowd, her voice ringing out above the noise. This is not just about one woman, one family. This is about all of us. This is about the truth that we've been hiding for far too long. The truth that we are not powerless. We are not invisible. We are the ones who built this city, and we will not be silenced. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in a collective roar. Clara's words were not just a call for justice. They were a declaration of war. The battle for the future of the city had begun, and there was no turning back. As the sun set over the city, the streets were filled with the sound of marching feet. The protests had become a full-fledged movement, unstoppable and fierce. Clara stood at the front, leading the charge, and behind her the people marched, not just for justice, but for the future. The Baker family's empire was teetering on the edge, and Marcus knew that the end was near. The question was no longer whether he could save it. The question was what he was willing to sacrifice to keep it intact. And in the end, the cost might be higher than he was willing to pay. As the train rattled along the tracks, its passengers unaware of the revolution unfolding outside, Clara's voice echoed in the air, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. And the city had stopped, but the people were just getting started. The city had become a battleground. The protests had turned from a sporadic cry for justice to a steady, unyielding drumbeat, reverberating through the streets, the buildings, the very soul of the city. Every corner was filled with tension, every passerby a witness to the storm that was growing. Clara Baker's name had become a symbol of defiance, of truth, of the fight against the system that had tried to silence her and so many others like her. But what had begun as a movement of one woman had now become a reckoning for a broken world. Marcus Baker III sat in his office once again, his face a mask of exhaustion and frustration. The reports were coming in faster now, the ones that talked about the protests spreading, the damage to his family's reputation, the calls from board members and influential allies asking what his next move would be. He could feel the walls closing in. The luxury of power, the privilege of control, seemed like distant memories now, like sand slipping through his fingers. He had been holding on for weeks, fighting a battle he no longer understood. The truth was that he was tired of pretending, tired of fighting, tired of the endless cycle of trying to maintain the empire that was crumbling under the weight of its own lies. He looked out the window, his eyes tracing the skyline, the buildings that his family had once owned, had once controlled. But those buildings, those walls, no longer seemed like symbols of strength. They seemed like prisons, encasing him in a world that was being dismantled piece by piece. The door to his office opened, and his sister, Deborah Baker, stepped inside. She looked as tired as he felt. The weight of the situation had taken its toll on her as well. She had always been the more pragmatic one, the one who had kept the family's affairs in order when Marcus was busy with the public face of their legacy. But now, there was no order to be found, no structure that could hold them up. "Marcus," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "It's over. We can't fight this anymore." Marcus clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're saying. We've fought for this family's legacy for generations. I won't just give up on it." Deborah shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "You think I don't understand? I've been trying to hold it together, trying to protect everything we've built. But we've lost." Clara's words. They've cut through everything. People don't care about our legacy anymore. They care about the truth. And the truth is that our family has been part of a system that's broken, that's crushed people like Clara for decades. Marcus stood up, pacing back and forth across the room. "I'm not letting it go down like this. We can't just let the media, the protesters, the people, Take everything we've built. My grandfather fought for this. My father fought for this. We fought for this. Deborah's voice was quiet but firm, cutting through his rising panic. Fighting for this. What? To maintain the lie. To protect our privilege while others suffered. Can't you see that we're at the end of it? All of us. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. I've worked my whole life for this. I deserve this. I don't think you understand, Deborah said softly, stepping closer to him. This isn't about what you deserve. It's about what's right. And what's right is that we stop pretending that we haven't been part of a system that's taken everything from people like Clara. The protests, the anger, the truth. It's bigger than us now. Marcus turned away, unable to meet her gaze. The guilt was already settling in, creeping into the corners of his mind. He had spent his entire life building an empire, but at what cost? What had they taken from people like Clara? From the very people who had built the city with their sweat and their blood, only to be pushed to the margins, ignored, or worse, abused. Outside, the streets were alive with action. The protests had reached a tipping point. What had started as an organized demonstration had become a full-scale movement, a rebellion against the structures that kept people like Clara invisible. The people in the streets were no longer just marching for justice. They were marching for dignity, for recognition, for a future where their voices could not be drowned out by the weight of a corrupt system. Clara stood at the forefront, her eyes locked onto the growing crowd in front of her. The air was thick with anticipation, the sound of chanting filling the streets. She had fought for this moment, had waited for the day when the truth would break through and the world would finally see what she had known all along, that the system was broken and that the people had the power to change it. Her voice rang out over the loudspeakers, clear and powerful. This fight isn't just about one woman. This fight is for every person who's ever been told they don't matter. This fight is for every person who's been crushed by a system that doesn't care about them. This fight is for the future, for a world where we are all seen, where we are all heard. The crowd roared, their voices rising in unison, a testament to the strength of the movement that had come together. For Clara, it wasn't just about the victory of one moment. It was about the possibility of a new world, one where the truth would no longer be buried, one where power would be held accountable, and one where people would no longer have to fight just to be seen. Marcus walked out of his office and onto the rooftop, the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. He looked out over the city, the skyline familiar and yet foreign to him now. The world outside seemed different, as if the fabric of reality had shifted in the wake of the protests, in the wake of Clara's voice. He had a choice to make. His family had spent decades building this empire, but at what cost? Was it worth fighting for a legacy that had come at the expense of so many? Was it worth holding on to power when that power had been used to keep people down? In that moment, Marcus understood. He understood what Clara had been fighting for all along. It wasn't just about the past or the present. It was about the future. And the future belonged to the people, to those who had been oppressed, to those who had been silenced for far too long. The choice was clear. He turned to the door, walking back inside, his steps slower now, more deliberate. When he reached his desk, he picked up the phone and dialed. The call connected. "We're done," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Tell the board, we're selling the transit system. It's time for change." The following weeks were a blur. The Baker family's empire was sold off, its pieces scattered to the winds. The people, the ones who had marched, who had fought for their voices to be heard, celebrated. Clara stood alongside them, her eyes bright with the fire of victory. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a beginning where power was no longer something that was hoarded and protected, but something that was shared. And Marcus, he stood in the background, watching. He had stepped aside, had acknowledged the broken system that had once served him, but now he was no longer the one in control. His place in the world had shifted, and he understood the price of that power now. The power that had once protected him was the same power that had crushed the very people who had made him who he was. As the city moved forward, the train tracks that had once symbolized the Baker family's empire were now a symbol of the past. a past that had been built on the backs of the people who had been forgotten. But Clara Baker, standing at the forefront of the movement, was a beacon of hope for the future, a future where everyone had a place, where everyone had a voice. And the city, though scarred by its history, was beginning to heal. The tracks they walked were no longer just a path forward. They were a reminder of the journey they had made, and the journey still ahead. Thank you for following this story until the very end. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did you think about this journey? Have you ever experienced racism or witnessed it in your life? Your experiences and feedback are incredibly important to us, and we truly value each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. We appreciate your support and would love to continue sharing these stories with you. Wishing you a great day ahead. And if you've listened to this story until the end, leave a comment with the phrase, "The tracks we walk are the future," so we know you've made it this far.